The vibration frequency had changed overnight. Not a dramatic shift, a forensic one. The kind of change you would never notice without 14 weeks of baseline data, without measuring instruments taped to 3 different trunks at 3 different elevations, without a waterproof notebook in which, every 4 hours, a record existed. A forensic ecologist would notice. Solveig Marta Fenn was a forensic ecologist. She noticed at 4:17 a.m. the canopy station existed at 240 feet above the forest floor that no longer existed as it had. The oil lamp burned amber through its glass chimney, casting the 4 of them, and their equipment, and their water stores, and their 3-week-old argument in the warm palette of survived another night. Darren Ash was awake before she was. He usually was. He had lived in this forest for 20 years, and he still listened to it the way some people listen to the breathing of someone they love. It was not a comfortable life, 240 feet up, but the comfort was the wrong metric. Safety was the metric, and safety, Solveig had established beyond reasonable doubt, existed in the inverse of elevation. Below 30 feet, you were in feeding territory. Above 80, you were likely safe. Above 200, nothing had reached anyone yet. The evidence was extensive. She had compiled it herself, over 14 weeks, in the notebook currently on her lap. Soil samples, soil compaction measurements in the compression craters at ground level, 3 surface fragments of the entity's outer carapace recovered from recent emergence sites, one of which, when examined under the field microscope, had revealed a chitin layer beneath the stone exterior that was, structurally, cellular. Alive. Not in any kingdom of life previously documented. The soil sample from the nearest crater had also contained, embedded in the compression layer, a structural protein not found in any annotated biological database, previously identified, a case note suggested, only in a submission from a research station off the Adriatic coast, case number redacted. Every forensic investigator recognizes the moment the evidence exceeds the framework. Most choose, at that point, to acquire a different framework. Solveig had chosen to acquire more evidence.
The seismometer array at the lower station is still transmitting. For now.
Priya Chandak sat against the far cable anchor, her Park Service jacket long since replaced by layers of whatever had stayed dry. 53 years old, former Valdris Tract ranger, now the group's institutional memory, which was a diplomatic way of describing the fact that Priya was the only person present who had heard the old stories about the deep trembling and had simply nodded at the emergence events instead of disbelieving. She was reading the seismometer feed on the tablet, not reading for information, reading the way you read a face you know, checking on the state of something you care about.
The west anchor cable is holding better than I expected. Whoever installed this station 3 months before the emergence was working with good materials.
The whoever was Darren. He said it without irony. He was braiding a secondary cable line, his hands moving through the work by memory, and below him, if you looked down through the platform grating at 240 feet, the fog was visible as a solid ceiling of gray-blue, the canopy puncturing through it like the masts of ships that had not yet sunk. Aurelio Vasque had not slept. Solveig knew this because Aurelio, when he had slept, did not pace the perimeter of a platform 240 feet above a feeding zone. When he had not slept, he did. He was currently on his 3rd circuit, one hand tracing the railing cable as he moved, always touching something, always calculating load bearing.
The feeding arc calculation I ran last night. Do you want to hear it? Or do you want to take more measurements first?
I've taken the measurements. The frequency changed.
Changed how?
The dominant frequency dropped by 3.2 hertz. It's been steady for 6 weeks at 18.7. It's now at 15.5. That's not geological drift. That's a behavioral shift.
The dominant frequency dropped by 3.2 hertz.
A behavioral shift implied behavior. Behavior implied intention, or at least pattern. The entities showed no evidence of intention in any cognitive sense. They were geological in their scale, biological in their mechanism, and catastrophically indifferent to anything above their feeding plane. But patterns they had. Solveig had documented 11 of them. She opened the notebook to the latest entry. The compression craters nearest to their position had expanded. The feeding arc, which she had been mapping for 3 weeks using the geometric relationship between emergent sites, had shifted orientation. The previous arc had been proceeding in a direction that would carry the feeding territory approximately 800 meters east of their position. The new arc was oriented northwest. Northwest was where they were.
Well, it's moving toward us. That's polite of it.
Solveig presented the updated arc calculation to the group without editorial. The numbers spoke without requiring amplification. 72 hours, perhaps 90, before the nearest entity's feeding territory encompassed the cluster of old-growth trees where the canopy station was anchored. After that, the trees were in feeding territory. The forest floor would compress. The root systems would dissolve. A 300-year-old Douglas fir without a root system was a falling tree. They had known this was coming. The pragmatist had been saying so for 3 weeks. He was not wrong. Solveig did not say so, but she noted it, internally, with the specific discomfort of a scientist whose subject, and an engineer whose math, had arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions.
Calculations don't matter.
Deren spoke to Aurelio, but his hands never stopped working the cable braid. He was always working. This was not calm. It was the specific management strategy of someone who had noticed that the moment his hands stopped moving, he began to grieve. There was an enormous amount here to grieve. The forest below was not as it had been. The old-growth cluster they were anchored in was alive and intact, elevated enough, rooted deep enough in the rock above the compression layer to have survived the feeding arcs that had proceeded through the valley 2 months ago. But the valley was visible from the platform. On clear days when the fog thinned above the canopy, it was a compression field now, a geometric grid of shallow craters, perfectly spaced, the dead trees standing like gray monuments. Deren had named 6 of them when they were living. He had not named them since.
The old community never fully left the Valdris Tract. Their records say that.
Priya said it the way you say something you've always known is important and have been waiting for the right moment to deliver. No one asked her to elaborate. The moment passed. At 22:14, as Solveig was completing her frequency shift analysis and Aurelio had finally, exhaustedly stopped pacing, the vibration in the platform's deck changed pitch. Solveig noted the time, noted the new frequency, noted that the oil lamp's flame was moving in a rhythm not caused by wind. She looked south, through the gap in the canopy that faced the valley. 400 meters distant, the fog that filled the valley floor was not still. A section of it, a roughly circular section, perhaps 40 meters in diameter, was rising. Not rising the way fog rises when ground heat disperses it. Rising because something below was pushing it upward, because something below was coming up. The quartz striations lit violet first. That was the sequence. The first light always appeared in the lines, pulsing from deep in the exposed surface outward toward the edges. Then the full arch emerged above the fog line, a section of what had always looked like a ridgeline, a section of what the regional geological survey maps had labeled a glacial outwash feature, rising in the amber-touched fog light and the first violet bioluminescence of an active feeding event. The data had implied this. The evidence had built toward this. 14 weeks of documentation in a waterproof notebook had been building toward the specific empirical moment of witnessing the evidence become real in 3 dimensions at 400 meters distance. It was 40 meters of exposed surface. It was the fingertip of something Aurelio had calculated at 300 meters in diameter. It was the most beautiful thing Solveig had ever seen. It was the most terrible thing any of them had ever seen, both at once, and that was the most forensic observation she had ever had to record. The notebook was already open. Her hand was not steady. She wrote anyway. In the morning, the entity had submerged. This was consistent with the behavioral data. The feeding events lasted 6 to 11 minutes per emergence. After submersion, the entities entered a dormancy period ranging from 4 to 7 hours before the next cycle. The dormancy period was not rest in any biological sense. The subsonic vibration continued throughout. The compression craters continued their slow expansion. But the emergence arch was absent. The forest floor was flat. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. Solveig had known for 14 weeks. She descended to the understory threshold anyway. Reconnaissance, she had called it, and Aurelio had called it something else. The argument had taken 40 minutes and resolved in the specific way that arguments between a forensic ecologist and a geological engineer resolve. Neither side changed their position, and the scientist descended anyway because the data she needed was not available at 240 feet, and the engineer descended with her because the alternative was watching her go alone, and that outcome he had already calculated to be worse. Priya stayed above, monitoring the seismometer feed. Darren was building something, an anchor improvement, a cable redundancy, with the specific, focused grief of a man giving his hands something important to do, while the argument below him moved without resolution toward the inevitable.
Something large has shifted. The fog is denser here.
At 80 feet, the color of the world changed. Below, the fog was a ceiling that had become a floor. It was blue-gray, dimensionless, without shadows, without direction, a light that had no source because it had been diffused through 80 feet of moisture-laden air until every photon was equally distributed, equally cold. Above, the canopy was amber. The morning light through the surviving old-growth crowns was warm, golden, biological, the light that falls on living things. The threshold was at 100 feet, precisely. Solveig had measured it. Below 100 feet, the ambient temperature dropped 4.3 degrees Celsius, and the light color shifted from 3,200 Kelvin to approximately 5,900 Kelvin, from candlelight to daylight cold. The atmospheric evidence of a boundary as clear as any door. She noted it. She always noted it. Then she descended below it into the cold.
While also knowing it cannot hear you, the lower sensor station is at 60 feet. We are currently at 90. There are 30 feet between us and the last monitoring equipment, 20 feet above the zone where we have confirmed feeding activity in the past 6 weeks.
I know where we are.
I am noting it for the record.
You know I'm the one keeping the record.
At 60 feet, the sensor station was intact. The housing was damp but functional, the data stream continuous, the temperature log showing the 4.3 degree variance she'd already recorded from the threshold descent. Solveig copied the data to the notebook. 3 weeks of ground-level atmospheric readings, vibration intensity logs, and one notation that made her stop and read twice. The notation was from week 11 of deployment. The vibration log showed a 7-second gap in the subsonic cycle, complete cessation, then resumption. This had happened twice at 71-hour intervals. It was not dormancy, it was too short. It was something else. She had no framework for what it was. She wrote, "Unknown behavioral event, duration 7 seconds, may indicate sensory sweep rather than feeding behavior. Evidence insufficient, requires more data." She underlined, "requires more data." Aurelio saw her do it. He did not comment. They were preparing to ascend when the fog, 200 meters south-southwest, changed. The forensic investigator's voice at its clearest and most controlled, because this is the moment the evidence exceeds all frameworks simultaneously, and the only response available is exact observation. The sequence was identical to the previous night, reduced in scale and distance. First, the subsonic vibration shifted pitch. Then, a section of the fog floor moved upward, pushed from below. Then, the quartz striations lit violet at their leading edges, pulsing outward from the center of the exposed surface in waves measured at approximately 1.2 seconds per wave cycle. Then, the arch emerged above the fog line, recording the most important data of their professional life, while also understanding they may not survive to file the report. Full emergence. At distance, 200 meters, at 60 feet of elevation, looking slightly upward at the emergence arch visible above the fog line, the complete first view of an ancient horror in active feeding posture. The exposed surface was 40 meters across and 12 to 15 meters above the fog line at peak emergence. The outer layer, schist gray, geological, convincingly mineral, was not smooth. It was striated with the quartz lines she had measured in the shed fragment, finger-wide, running in perfect parallel, pulsing violet in their active feeding state. In the gaps between the stone layer sections, where the emergence process had cracked the outer surface, the secondary material was exposed, amber, glistening, shot through with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in a rhythm she had to count, once per 14 seconds. The upper surface, the surface that faced the sky, the surface that was visible to them at 60 feet, eyeless. Completely. Not damaged eyeless, not vestigial eyeless, architecturally eyeless. The upward-facing surface had no sensory architecture of any kind. It had never needed to look at the sky. It had always looked down. On the entity's exposed surface, at the margins of the stone carapace, where the emergence had cracked the outermost layer, vegetation, moss, living moss and lichen with rooted hold, things that grew on it, things that had been elevated above the feeding plane by the entity's own surface, elevated enough that the entity's feeding mechanism could not dissolve them. Small things, living things. The entity's back was a landscape, an ecosystem. Solveig wrote, vegetation present on surface, root contact with carapace, elevated above feeding plane by entity's own emergence height, safe. Things on the entity are safe. She stared at what she had written. He was correct. The feeding event was proceeding in a direction perpendicular to their position and receding, but the dormancy period that followed would last only 4 to 7 hours, and their current elevation put them in a range that, should a feeding event occur directly beneath them during that window, would be insufficient. Solveig closed the notebook. She looked at the emergence arch one more time, the violet pulsing in the quartz lines, the amber glistening chitin in the cracks, the moss at the margins of the stone surface living on the entity's back without the entity knowing. She had been documenting evidence of something she could not fully know. Here was the thing itself. She had been right. And being right was not the same as being safe, and both of those things were still true simultaneously. The ascent took 11 minutes. At 100 feet, the warmth returned. At 160, she could see the amber light of the oil lamp in the canopy station above her. At 240, Darren pulled her over the platform edge without asking whether she was all right. He knew she wasn't. She wasn't asking to be. That evening, while Aurelio ran his updated descent timing calculations and Priya reviewed the sensor feed, Solveig planned the solo descent to recover the lower sensor station. It contained 3 weeks of data she had not yet copied. She had copied some of it today, not all. The gap in the dormancy pattern, the 7-second cessation events, the data for those were in the station housing's memory, not yet in her notebook. She was going back down. She told Darren, He did not tell the others. He began, quietly, braiding a secondary safety line. Before Solveig descended, Priya sat with Darren.
There is a presence down
Darren Ashe was not a man who asked questions he didn't want answered. He sat beside the cable anchor where Priya kept her watch, and after a long time he said, with his eyes on the fog below, "The old community. You said they never fully left."
Unhurried, the original communities in this valley. The ones who were here before any of this was a timber region. They didn't leave, not initially. They were here during the first emergence events. The oral record describes the deep trembling as something they recognized, something they had protocols for.
What protocols?
With a kind of heavy satisfaction, they went up,
Protocols.
into the canopy. They built in the high branches, platforms, bridges, whole communities at elevation. The forest wasn't just their home, it was their sanctuary protocol. The trees were already the answer.
Something settled in Darren Ashe's face. Not relief, something older than relief. The specific expression of someone who has been making the right choice without knowing why, and has just been told why.
I wasn't going to leave the trees anyway.
I know, that's why I told you.
At 7:40, during a dormancy window confirmed by 3 consecutive clean seismometer readings, Solveig began her solo descent to the sensor station at 60 feet. The plan was simple. 11 minutes down, copy the remaining data including the 7-second cessation events, 11 minutes up. Total exposure below the threshold, 22 minutes, well within the confirmed dormancy window minimum. The dormancy window was 4 to 7 hours. The last feeding event had ended at 3:15. It was 7:40. 4 hours and 25 minutes into a dormancy window with a minimum duration of 4 hours. She had written in the notebook, operating within minimum dormancy window, acceptable margin. She had underlined minimum. She had descended anyway. This was the evidence that documentation was not, in fact, the same as safety. At 60 feet, she reached the sensor station in 10 minutes. She opened the housing and began the data copy. The fog was thick around her, the cold blue-gray quality of below-threshold atmosphere, the ambient temperature 4.3 degrees lower than the platform above, the light directionless and flat. She could not see the valley floor. She could see approximately 8 meters in any direction before the fog closed. She was on the way through the second week of dormancy cessation data when the vibration changed. Not the slow change she had documented over 14 weeks, not the behavioral shift she had measured over 3 days. An immediate, present tense change, the subsonic frequency dropping by 12 hertz in under 4 seconds, which her body registered before her instruments because her body had learned, over 14 weeks, what 12 hertz felt like in the sternum when it dropped that fast. She closed the notebook. She sealed the sensor housing. She reached for the cable. The fog floor moved. Not 200 meters south-southwest, directly beneath her. The sequence: vibration shift, fog floor rising, first violet pulse in the quartz striations, but compressed, accelerated, happening in the space of 18 seconds instead of the 90 seconds she had observed from 200 meters distance. At 60 feet, 18 seconds was not enough time to ascend to safety. She ascended anyway. She moved up the cable with both hands and both feet, moving faster than she had trained for, and the thing below her was rising. The most precise passage in 14 weeks of documentation. At 90 feet, she stopped. Below her, where she had been standing 45 seconds earlier, the entity's emergence arch. Not the complete observation she had made yesterday at 200 meters, the complete observation from 28 feet above the entity's upward surface. The quartz lines pulsing violet at arm's length, the amber chitin glistening in the cracks, the geometry of something so large that its curve was barely perceptible. like standing 28 feet above the back of something that the mind keeps reclassifying as terrain rather than anatomy. It was not 20 meters below her. It was 28 feet. She could smell it, mineral cold, deep earth, and something else, sweet, concentrated, the smell of an atmosphere that had been sealed underground for a span of time that predated the forest above it. It did not know she was there. The notebook shifted on her back. The waterproof case she had built for it, the clip attachment to her harness shoulder strap, had been checked that morning, checked every morning. The vibration had resonated with the clip's spring tension for the duration of the emergence event. 45 seconds of subsonic vibration at 30 feet's distance from a 400-meter diameter biological entity had done what 14 weeks of daily movement had not. The clip released. The notebook fell. It turned once in the air above the entity's surface, pages opening. 3 weeks of feeding frequency data, 7 of behavioral mapping, 14 of accumulated observation that represented the only systematic forensic record of the entity's behavioral patterns in existence. And then it was below the emergence arch level, and then it was in the fog, and then it was gone. The entity submerged 8 minutes later, the standard duration. Above her, a figure on the descent cable, moving fast, without the careful rhythm of Darren's training, moving with the specific rhythm of Aurelio Vasque, who had been watching the seismometer feed from above and had counted the seconds between the vibration shift and Solveig's last radio check, and had made, characteristically, the calculation that the probability of her requiring assistance exceeded the probability of his presence making things worse. He descended to 70 feet, stopping above the fog line, hands on the cable, scanning below with the intensity of someone who does not perform intensity but simply has it. A pause. The pause of an engineer processing the implications of an event and arriving at an assessment.
Its surface 12 meters. What is that on? What have you touched?
She stopped, because at that moment she became aware that Aurelio's descent had brought him below the threshold line, and that the dormancy period had re-established itself, and that his right hand, the one not gripping the cable, was pressed flat against the trunk of the old-growth Douglas fir, palm down, fingers spread, and he had not moved it since stopping at 70 feet. He had descended below the threshold. His hand was on the tree. His hand was 14 feet above the forest floor through 70 feet of air, and the tree's root system extended down into the compression depth, and the entity's surface had brushed the base of this tree during its emergence, had been in geological contact with the root system for 8 minutes. The tree was a cable, a biological cable running from the entity's feeding surface up through 70 feet of living wood to the hand of Aurelio Vasque. His palm lit violet, not brightly, a faint network, the width of a thread, following the capillary paths under the skin of his palm and first 3 fingers. He looked at his hand. He did not move. 20 minutes later, at the canopy station, the violet had faded to barely visible. Aurelio sat with his right hand on his knee, palm up, flexing the fingers slowly, with the expression of a geological engineer who has just become the most significant piece of data in his own data set. He looked up at Solveig, who was at the edge of the platform looking down at the fog below where the notebook was. If you've stayed with us this long, if you've climbed with them this far, you know this isn't over. Subscribe to Phantom Frame Studios. The next story goes deeper. Aurelio pressed his hand flat to the platform deck. His eyes went distant in the specific way of someone attending to a sensation that has no vocabulary yet.
I can feel it. The next feeding cycle. It's a pause. 4 hours and 18 minutes from now, approximately.
Solveig looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the fog. Then she looked at her empty harness shoulder strap. The notebook was down there, and in it, the only data that could tell them whether Aurelio's biological sensing was accurate. They went down at first light. All 4 of them. This had not been the plan. The plan had been Solveig alone, retrieving the notebook from the compression zone during the dormancy window that Aurelio's palm had calculated at 4 hours and 17 minutes from the previous feeding event. But Darren had already secured the additional safety lines, and Priya had already shouldered her pack, and Aurelio had already checked the harnesses with the specific thoroughness of an engineer who does not perform thoroughness but simply has it. Nobody had taken a vote. Sometimes the group's decision was simply the convergence of 4 separate decisions that happened to point the same direction. At 140 feet, the ambient light was split. Amber from above, blue-gray rising from below. The understory threshold visible as a gradient that ran approximately 20 feet of atmosphere, the living ferns and climbing moss in this zone straddling the boundary, roots reaching into cold air and leaves reaching into warm. The forest's own threshold keepers. At 80 feet, the amber ended. Below the fog line, the forest was dead and standing. Trees killed by subsonic vibration 3 weeks past, their forms still present, their bark gray and dry, their absence of living detail more unsettling than collapse would have been. Dead standing forests look like photographs of living ones. The detail is wrong. The sound is wrong. The smell is mineral and cold. The organic warmth of growing things replaced by the mineral cold of things that had been dissolved from below. 60 feet, the sensor station still transmitting. 40 feet, the transition zone where living root systems gave way to compression-damaged soil. 30 feet, the upper boundary of historical feeding activity. 30 feet below them, the ground. The notebook was visible from 30 feet. A pale green rectangle against the dark soil of the compression zone floor, lodged at the margin of a compression crater, pages splayed open but not dissolved. The waterproof polymer cover had done its function. 3 weeks of data remained on pages that had spent 5 hours on the floor of a feeding zone.
Observing, not afraid. The specific tone of someone who has been through worse and knows the shape of manageable fear. The crater margin it landed on, that's between 2 feeding compression sites. The entity's surface never contacted that specific spot. The craters are the impact zones, not the margins.
This was correct. The compression craters were the footprint of the entity's feeding surface making contact with the ground. The margins were the spaces between footprints. The notebook had fallen into a footprint margin. It had survived by geometry. Aurelio's right hand was pressed flat to the nearest intact trunk at 30 feet, the lowest safe anchor point. His eyes were closed. His breathing was controlled.
We have a window. The next feeding event is 3 hours and 52 minutes out, approximately. The approximately has a margin of error I cannot quantify because I have been a biological instrument for 11 hours and do not yet have baseline calibration data.
He paused.
Solveig would have a framework for that. We need the notebook.
Darren went first. This was also not the plan. Darren was not the field scientist, not the geological engineer, not the former park ranger. He was the arborist who knew the trees and the cables and the specific mechanical tolerances of survival at elevation. But at 30 feet, the decisions stopped being about specialty. At 30 feet, the decisions were about who was first off the cable and onto the ground. Darren stepped off the cable at 20 feet. his boots on the forest floor, the compression zone margin between craters, the notebook visible 11 meters ahead. He walked to it without running. Running was the wrong instinct here. Running was how you stopped attending to the ground beneath your feet. The something does not know he is there. He checked the cover. He opened it to the last entry. Solveig's handwriting, unknown behavioral event, 7, cessation, may indicate sensory sweep, evidence insufficient, requires more data. And he held it for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something that has survived something it shouldn't have. He walked back to the cable anchor. He did not run. The ascent took 17 minutes. At 40 feet, Aurelio's hand pulsed faintly violet once in the specific capillary pattern that had emerged at the point of contact, a brief brightening, subsiding immediately.
What was that?
I believe it's the entity's dormancy bioluminescence, the once per 4-minute amber pulse you documented. I'm receiving it as violet. The spectral shift may be because the incorporation occurred through the tree root system rather than direct surface contact.
A pause.
That is the most extraordinary piece of data from this entire 14 weeks.
Write it down.
The spike at 650 matches the feed arc signature exactly.
At 100 feet, the amber light returned, the warmth, the color of the canopy station's oil lamp and the color of survival, and Solveig noted this in the recovered notebook, sitting on the threshold cable with her back against the Douglas fir, the amber light on the page. The same color as the entity's dormancy bioluminescence, pulsing once per 4 minutes through the root systems of every living tree in the Valdris Tract. She wrote, "The amber pulse is the entity at rest. The amber light is the entity. The forest is not the location where the entities feed. The forest is the feeding architecture. The trees grew because the entities required biological mass at ground level. The biological mass required trees to produce it. The forest is the entity's farm." She underlined farm. She stared at what she had written. And then, the reckoning. Not a sudden collapse of understanding, but the specific forensic experience of a framework that has been accumulating evidence, finally completing its own picture. The Valdris Tract had been protected from extensive logging because the survey crews that went deepest encountered geological instability. The original communities had built in the canopy and had oral records of the deep trembling, predating any human institutional memory of the region. The amber light above the fog line was not just safe, it was the entity's own ambient biological signal, and the trees that carried it were the entity's infrastructure, and the 14-week period of documentation Solveig had completed was a forensic record of the oldest ecosystem on this coastline, the entities and the forest they had been building for an indeterminate span of time. This was the reckoning. There was no wilderness to save. There was only the ongoing geological meal and the canopy above it, and the 240-foot platform where 4 people had survived not by accident, but because elevation was the oldest strategy. They reached the coastal road at 1422. The road was empty, had been empty for weeks. The asphalt cracked from a feeding event that had crossed beneath it and moved on. To the west, coast. To the east, the Valdris Tract, visible as a wall of surviving old-growth canopy above the fog line. In the afternoon light, the canopy was amber. Below the canopy, where the fog met the lower branches, the bioluminescence was visible. Violet arcs pulsing through the fog in geometric sequences, each pulse moving outward from a center point in the valley, the feeding cycles continuing as they had continued for longer than anyone present had a number for. Darren stood at the tree line and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He did not look like a man saying goodbye to a forest. He looked like a man looking at something he had always loved without fully knowing what it was, and finding that knowing what it was did not diminish the love. Changed it, yes, the way all complete knowledge changes something, but did not take it away. He was the one who had said 3 weeks ago, "If we leave, we're saying it doesn't matter what was here." He left anyway. The leaving did not say it didn't matter. The leaving was the proof that it did.
Still.
Priya had the coastal map. Aurelio had his feeding cycle palm. The next inhabited community was 60 kilometers west, potentially accessible, potentially still occupied, certainly better than the alternative. Aurelio looked at his right hand. He pressed it flat against the coastal road surface. His eyes went distant in the attending way. After a moment,
The road substrate isn't connected to the root systems. I can't sense them from here.
he sounded mildly disappointed. The geological engineer who had spent 3 weeks arguing for flight over understanding, who had become the most significant data instrument in the record, who had argued that Solveig's methodology was the wrong response to an emergency, pressed his hand to the ground, briefly unable to sense the entities, and was disappointed. She noted it. She wrote it in the recovered notebook. AV, attempted sensing from road substrate. Root connectivity absent at coastal road. No signal received. Expression, mild disappointment. Query, will the biological incorporation persist? Unknown. Will require data over time. Requires more data. It always required more data. This was not a flaw in her position. It was her position. The record existed. The record had survived. The record was the proof that it mattered to know.
If you're watching this, Dawis, if this record reached you 2 days, it means the documentation survived.
She held the notebook up. The coastal afternoon light caught it. The dark green waterproof cover, damp but intact. The data inside legible, the record complete. Behind her, the Valdris Tract rose 300 feet above the fog line, amber in the late light. Below that amber, the violet arcs of the feeding cycles, pulsing outward through the fog in geometric sequences, the forest breathing in. It had always been breathing in. They just hadn't had the data to see it. Now they did.